I don't think it's going to completely upset the market and cause a major realignment. I mean, it's really just putting content that was already out there on different services together under one corporate roof. But I mean, from the consumer's point of view and from competitors' points of view, I just don't think it's really going to be that disruptive.
Hey gang, it's Tuesday, May 3rd. Paul and listeners, welcome to the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by M-Particle. I'm Marcus. Today I'm joined by our principal analyst who heads up our advertising and media practice. It's Paul Verna.
Great to be here.
Hey fella, today's fact. Martin Luther King Jr. got a C in public speaking. So the world remembers Dr. King as a leader of the civil rights movement, and people often quote his I Have a Dream speech, which he delivered in 1963. More than a decade before that legendary speech, while attending a theological seminary in Pennsylvania, he earned a C in public speaking during his first and second term. It's kind of like, you know, Michael Jordan, they say that like he didn't make the varsity basketball team. I was just going to bring up Michael Jordan. I was just going to bring him up.
His
sophomore year of high school.
Yeah.
But they say that putting Jordan on the JV team gave him more playing time than riding the varsity bench. So sometimes things happen for a reason.
I guess so, but I don't know if there's a varsity or JV equivalent in Martin Luther King's case. I think it was just a really bad judgment on the part of whichever professor gave him a C.
Yeah, or maybe he just wasn't good enough there. It's kind of like they're kind of rehashing, you know, what the scout report was on Tom Brady when he went 199th in the draft.
Yeah.
And the scout report was accurate. He didn't have a very strong arm and he couldn't scramble and kept getting sacked a lot. And, you know, just because he wasn't a good player then clearly didn't mean he couldn't turn into a good player. But
yeah, so maybe Martin Luther King's C was the motivation he needed. The Beatles got rejected in every audition they went to until the one they got, so.
Good point. Part of the struggle.
Yep.
Anyway, today's real topic, Google's Q1 2022. All right, Paul, we're talking all things Google. We'll talk about some of their revenue highlights, what you make of them overall, some of the numbers that really jumped out to you, and then anything else interesting that we need to discuss with regards to how Google performed in January, February, and March of this year. Let's go through their highlights, kind of four main highlights here for you. Number one, Google advertising. So we're not doing Alphabet, we're just doing Google. So Google advertising accounts for about 80% of the money that Alphabet makes. We're just talking about that bit. So Google advertising pulled in nearly $55 billion in Q1. That will be up 22% year on year. That's down from the 32% it had last Q1. Still healthy. They made $10 billion more this Q1 than last year's Q1, put a different way. The second thing, 72% of that $55 billion that Google made from ads comes from Google Search and other. That's up 24%. Slightly down on last Q1's growth. The third thing, Google Network. That accounts for about 15% of the total. That was up 20%, slower than last Q1's 30%. And then YouTube is the last line item we've got for you. That makes up the rest pretty much, that 13% of the total. That was up just 14%. Last Q1, it grew close to 50%. More than 3 times slower growth for YouTube. Paul, on the whole, the revenue growth figures this quarter for you were blank.
Not as bad as you would think from the headlines. I mean, you know,
I know.
If you separate Wall Street's, I consider unrealistic expectations, the numbers you just cited, I think for your run-of-the-mill $1.5 trillion company registering well into double-digit percentage increases quarter to quarter to quarter, it's pretty good. So yeah, obviously they missed on some of the guidance, and we can talk about some of the areas where the misses were more pronounced. But overall, I mean, this is a healthy business. There are competitive threats, there are dynamics that are working against Google and lots of other businesses, but the sky is not falling on this company.
Mm-hmm. And Ruth Porat, Alphabet's CFO, Google's CFO as well, she makes the very relevant point of, hey, you know, our growth in the coming quarters, and this quarter as well, this year basically, may look modest compared with last year, because last year's growth looked great, in part because of favorable comparisons to a very tough 2020. So it's not exactly apples to apples. It's like Granny Smiths to Pink Ladies. Pink Ladies are so much better.
I always find it refreshing when a CEO or a CFO is honest about the company's outlook and puts the results into the kind of perspective that Ruth Porat did. I've singled out Reed Hastings from Netflix for doing that as well. And, I think it's a good quality and often lacking in C-level executives.
Yeah, absolutely. And they often get killed for it, as opposed to pretending everything's going to be up and to the right forever and ever. Paul, let's talk about some of the revenue figures in particular. What were two of the most interesting revenue figures for you this quarter?
I think the two most interesting things, and they're very high level aspects, are that search did very well and video did not do as well. And on the surface, you would think that some of the dynamics that are pushing video down a bit would apply to search. But I think when you start peeling back the layers, there are reasons why search is doing well. Google remains by far the market leader in that space. And even some of the competitive factors that are working against Google, like the rise of retail media networks, there is actually a benefit there for Google because some of those searches begin on Google and then they extend out to a wider universe of competitors. But the more that people are shopping online and the more that industries like travel and automotive are returning to normalcy, the more it benefits Google. So obviously their search business doing well is a product of all that. So it makes sense in that regard.
I want to touch on the travel portion for a quick second because, interesting to see that analysts pointed to the rebound in travel as pandemic restrictions continued to ease as one reason the company's revenue growth did well. Megan Bobrowski of the Wall Street Journal was noting, but Google's chief business officer, Philip Schindler, said travel searches in Q1 of this year were above what Google had seen in the pre-pandemic Q1 2019. So it does really seem like travel is giving them quite the tailwind.
Absolutely.
And your second figure that jumped out to you, you talked about video and that not doing so well. What's going on there?
And first of all, again, to put it in perspective, I mean, YouTube grew at about 14% year over year. So it's not exactly doing poorly.
Sky's not falling.
Right. But there is kind of a double whammy or triple whammy going on there. On the one hand, on the mobile side of the market, you have TikTok really emerging as a significant competitor and taking a lot of users away from YouTube or time spent. So this is something we've talked about before, where a lot of things that Google had been known for are really becoming more TikTok's domain now. So I think that's significant. Yes.
Our director of commerce and marketing briefings, Jeremy Goldman, he thinks the same, that slowing ad growth on YouTube appears to correlate with a surge in TikTok ad growth. But there was a chart that he included in a recent article that showed that our forecasts still show YouTube has a very sizable user advantage over TikTok. Gen Z, YouTube to TikTok users, Gen Z, it's 83% of Gen Z are on YouTube, 61% on TikTok. Millennials, it's 82% on YouTube, 42% on TikTok. Gen X, 72 to 18 in YouTube's favor, and Boomers, it's 51 to 6. So YouTube does still have a massive advantage user-wise, particularly with the older folks, but we're not saying that TikTok's completely eating Google's lunch here, but you do think that TikTok is having a direct impact on Google's slowdown?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look beyond just those absolute numbers, the share numbers, which do favor YouTube, it's really more about the trend lines and the fact that TikTok is just sort of like emerging, it's getting bigger in that rearview mirror for YouTube. And I think also some of the more qualitative ways in which YouTube has dominated the market, even down to things like how-to videos, are things that are happening a lot more on TikTok. And if you look at TikTok's demographics, it's easy to see how as those people continue to sort of age into the market and, proliferate, that they will be more of a threat to YouTube's user base, which does skew a little bit older at this point.
Right. What about Shorts? So Jeremy Goldman also pointing out that Alphabet and Google CEO Sundar Pichai said that Shorts, YouTube's short form video feature and TikTok competitor, averages 30 billion daily views, over 30 billion daily views. That's double the viewership of Q4. I think it's quadruple the viewership of where they were a year ago. Do you see that as a competitor with TikTok now or at some point in the future, or is that a bit of a desperation move that will never really amount to what it hopes to in terms of really competing with TikTok?
I wouldn't call it a desperation move, but it is sort of a copycat move. But, I think the increases in viewership are real and significant. And especially when you look at a company like Meta, which is probably struggling with Reels to a greater extent than YouTube is with Shorts. So It's a good news story for YouTube. I do think, though, that the monetization on Shorts is not quite what it is on just regular video streams. So I think that's part of the issue here, is that the views can be through the roof, but, they're not monetizing to the same degree. So the profit margin is not as big there.
Right. So you mentioned there are a number of factors contributed to YouTube's slowdown, TikTok being one of them. What else is going on?
Well, at the other end of the market, at the connected TV end, there's just a tremendous amount of competition, and that competition is growing. I think we're going to talk a little bit more later in the show about some of the movement in that space. This is an area that I think YouTube has been really trying to crack. And, to some extent, they've definitely had their successes, but they definitely still are up against a lot of headwinds from, whether it's just the number of platforms or the fact that there's more churn going on, so more people are picking and choosing, and some of the platforms that were question marks maybe a year and a half ago are now very solidly in the mix, and I'm thinking of Apple TV in particular. So there's a lot there. They're not necessarily directly competitive in the sense that YouTube is primarily ad-supported and platforms like Apple are subscription-based, but you're still talking about attracting audiences to visual entertainment on that big screen. And that's what YouTube is really trying to do. And I think they're definitely getting a lot of pressure from that. And then the final thing I think that's really affecting YouTube in particular is just market conditions, inflation and supply chain disruptions, and now the war in Ukraine. Those are all factors that are pushing down ad spending because advertisers are more careful about their budget. In Eastern Europe, there's now an interruption in business for Google and for a lot of other companies. So those factors, I think, do not work in YouTube's favor. They probably don't work in favor of search that much either, for that matter, but search has been more resilient than video.
On those last 2 points, take the last one first in terms of market conditions, particularly in Europe. Google CFO Ms. Porat did say YouTube saw a drop in spending by brands in Europe tied to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that's not a problem going away anytime soon, unfortunately. And then the second point, there's some data from Nielsen showing all the time that people spent watching the television last February 2021. 6% watched Netflix and 6% watched YouTube of all the TV time that they could have spent. And those figures, Netflix went up a bit this year, YouTube went down a bit. So to your point, Paul, even though it's an ad-supported platform, they are competing with those other streaming players.
Yeah, and I know you just spoke with Ross Benish about Netflix's results, so even they've had a lot of trouble, and you just pointed out that essentially their viewership or their share of the big screen has increased. Comparison to YouTube, so that just kind of gives you an indication of how fraught that market is.
Absolutely. Anything else jump out to you this quarter for Google?
The thing that you pointed out about Ruth Porat and her tone, I thought was kind of a salient point, and she said that the company is not going to have that tailwind for the rest of this year than they've had. So again, I appreciate the frankness, and my ears always perk up when I see that or hear that in an earnings transcript.
Yeah. I mean, let's look at the numbers for a second. Growth, Google advertising, 22%. Growth, Google search, another 24%. Growth, Google network, 20%. Growth, YouTube, 14%. And that 14% growth for YouTube, we should say they made nearly $7 billion in Q1 off that 14% growth. So very, very healthy, solid kind of low 20% double-digit growth there of just 14% for YouTube. So that was definitely part of the story. But also part of the story was the net profit. Expenses were up in Q1 because of R&D. So net profit actually fell for the first quarter since Q2 2020. They still made over $16 billion, so don't panic. Just not the $18 billion that they saw last Q1. That's all we've got time for the lead time now for the halftime report. Paul, let's pop a grade on Google's Q1 performance and also give our listeners one takeaway from the first half.
I'm going to give Google a B for their Q1 revenue. And it's funny because there's so much negativity about this quarter, but it's almost like, when you're an A student and you've been an A+ student for the last 2 years, you get a B and suddenly everybody freaks out. If you're a C student and you get a B, then everybody claps. So, but I think a B is fair given where they're at and what the expectations are.
And what's the one takeaway for you? What's the one thing you think folks should really remember?
I think the takeaway is that investors should just take a deep breath. I mean, the stock didn't get battered too badly, but this is a company that has serious market leadership in many of the areas in which it operates, especially search. And I think in video, there's a lot of goodness, even amid the competitive threats. So I generally think that this is a healthy business. As Ruth Porat said, if they're not going to have big tailwinds for the rest of this year, if you're playing the long game, there's going to be a bounce back at some point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we still expect $70 billion in digital ad revenues for Google this year, and that translates into 28% share of the US digital ad revenue pie. 28% for Google this year, 27% next year, 26% the year after that. The dollars will continue to climb, the share pretty much flat by all intents and purposes. So still a pretty dominant position. And just for reference, Facebook, which will be in second place, is about 6 points below Google today and will still be 4 points below Google in terms of share in a couple of years' time. That's all we've got time for the lead. Time now for In Other News, but first a quick word from our sponsor, mParticle. At the end of the day, your customer has to be at the center of everything you do. This starts with the right customer data strategy, as well as the right foundation to solve the challenges that typically inhibit success, such as data quality, data governance, and connectivity. mParticle is your real-time customer data infrastructure that helps you accelerate your data strategy by cleansing, visualizing, and integrating your customer data from anywhere to anywhere. Ultimately, better data leads to better decisions, better customer experiences, and better outcomes. See why the best brands choose mParticle. Go to www.mparticle.com. Folks, we're back. Today in other news, bundled streaming options. And what kind of an impact can the newly formed Warner Brothers Discovery have on the media world? Story 1. 64% of folks want a bundled streaming option that would let them subscribe to as many or as few services across different companies as they like, according to Nielsen, notes insider intelligence analyst Daniel Konstantinovich. So people want to be able to bundle a Netflix subscription, for example, with a Hulu one, with a Paramount Plus one. There are a few bundles out there, but they're within their own ecosystems. Disney bundles Disney Plus, Hulu with Live TV and ESPN Plus together. Paramount plans to bundle Paramount Plus and Showtime. But as Danny points out, the few that exist are limited to a specific company's services. Paul, the future of the video streaming bundle, in your opinion, will be blank.
Will be a lot like the past. It'll be a throwback to the cable era. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're really kind of going back to the future here, where there's been such a proliferation of streaming platforms that by now people, they know what shows they want to watch, or they hear about a show, they want to watch it, and they're really forced to subscribe to, 6, 7, 8 platforms. That's part of the reason for the churn, is they're picking and choosing seasonally or by programming schedule. But it's no surprise that people just want to bundle these together, because having them all as individual subscriptions gets expensive and unwieldy.
Yeah. What do you make of the Verizon Plus Play? So Danny notes that the closest thing to what's described in Nielsen's report is Verizon Plus Play, recently launched hub that allows users to manage subscriptions to streaming and non-streaming services in one place. Will this type of service ever have a place in the streaming world? Can you see Netflix saying, hey, look, it benefits us to be bundled with other services because rising tide lifts all boats? Or do you see them saying, no, we're going to keep to our own, and if you want to bundle with us, then you'll come to one of our properties?
I think it's a non-starter. We've seen dribs and drabs of cable systems like Comcast basically allowing people to subscribe to Netflix, and we've seen Amazon and Roku aggregate subscriptions. There's always going to be some amount of that, but I think for any one company to be able to offer everything that consumers want is unrealistic because of the licensing issues. And even if it's a small amount of revenue that the provider is giving up, they're just not going to be willing to do that with the revenue pressures that they're under.
Yeah. Story 2. Discovery Inc. and Warner Media recently closed their mega merger, adding a new behemoth to the entertainment industry, writes John Coblin of the New York Times. He notes that the two companies will combine TV, movie, and news operations that draw revenue of nearly $50 billion, forming one of the biggest media companies in the country, called Warner Brothers Discovery. Mr. Coblin notes that the deal will be felt throughout the media world in the months to come. He thinks it could push smaller competitors to hunt for deals to beef up, and that rivals like Netflix, Disney, Amazon, and Apple now have a new ferocious competitor for streaming dominance. But Paul, the way Warner Brothers Discovery's impact will be felt throughout the media world, in your opinion, will be blank?
I think it'll be like 3.2 magnitude earthquake.
Is that high? I don't know the Richter scale.
It's not. You barely feel it. It's an earthquake.
Okay, technically.
It's seismic, but unless you're right near it, you're not going to feel it that much. And look, the market is already so saturated with streaming services that have so much to offer and that have large user bases. I mean, obviously Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, Disney, Apple. HBO Max is one of them, and Discovery Plus has been one of them. So putting those pieces together, I mean, it's certainly going to be one of the leading services. I should also mention Peacock in that group. But I don't think it's going to completely upset the market and cause a major realignment. I mean, it's really just putting content that was already out there on different services together under one corporate roof. But I mean, from the consumer's point of view and from competitors' points of view, I just don't think it's really going to be that disruptive.
And that is all we have time for. Thank you, Paul, for hanging out.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks to Todd, who's been helping us edit the show. Victoria will be back with us soon. We miss you. Thanks to everyone listening in. See you tomorrow for the Behind the Numbers Daily and eMarketer podcast made possible by mParticle.